Imagine being locked in a cell with nothing but your thoughts. You're isolated, trying to keep your mind from unraveling. Then the whispers begin. A voice you can't see. A presence you can't ignore. What would you do if the walls themselves started to haunt you? When I was 18, I found myself sitting in the back of a police car, handcuffed and staring out of the window at the unfamiliar lights of the city. The moment I was arrested felt surreal, like everything had slowed down. I had made a terrible decision, one that was fueled by desperation, anger, and a sense of hopelessness. But I never thought it would lead me here, to a dark, cold prison cell, separated from the world and trapped in the claustrophobic grip of the Florida Department of Corrections. I still remember the first time I stepped into Lake Butler Correctional. It was nothing like I expected. I'd been through the initial processing at Orlando's intake center, where everything was a blur of paperwork, confusion, and 1,000 other inmates just as scared and confused as I was. But Lake Butler, this secondary receiving center in Central Florida, felt like a different world altogether. Lake Butler wasn't just a place for people who had been convicted of crimes. It was more like a machine, designed to grind people down until they were no longer recognizable. The facility itself looked like it had been abandoned by time, isolated and surrounded by dense swampland. The air always felt thick with humidity, and the sound of the occasional distant swamp creatures only added to the eerie atmosphere. Even during the day, the place had a strange heaviness about it, as if the shadows themselves were alive and watching you. But the worst part of Lake Butler was the honeycomb. When I first saw it, I thought I was looking at some kind of ancient fortress. The building was a massive, honeycomb-shaped structure, built out of concrete blocks and designed to house hundreds of men in tight, suffocating cells. Its sheer size was overwhelming, and the way the building stretched out in every direction made it feel like it was swallowing everything around it. No matter where you were in the honeycomb, you could never escape its presence. Each cell was no bigger than a bathroom, with thin steel bars on one side and a tiny window high up on the wall. The concrete floor was cold and unyielding, and the walls felt like they were closing in on you the longer you stayed. It was the kind of place that could drive a man insane if he wasn't careful. But you could survive it, if you didn't let the place get to your head, if you didn't let it break you. At first, the guards weren't even the worst part. Sure, they had their usual swagger, walking through the halls with their deep southern accents and a chip on their shoulders. They weren't kind by any means, but at least they were predictable. They kept order, ensured the rules were followed, and generally didn't make things worse than they already were. The real horrors in the honeycomb weren't the guards or the gangs, but the whispers. Every prison has its stories, and Lake Butler was no exception. Some were about the guards, others about the prisoners. Some were exaggerated even more. And some were stories that you didn't really want to know about. But one story stuck with me from the moment I heard it, and it haunted me throughout my time in that place. The whispers. The whispers came from the box, the disciplinary dorm. It wasn't a place anyone wanted to end up. The box was the last stop, the place where the worst of the worst were sent to rot. And it was said that at 3 a.m., something would wake up in that dorm. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't a guard. It was a spirit, an entity that tormented the men who found themselves trapped there. The story went like this. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., this spirit would begin to whisper. The whispers weren't just noises, they were feelings. The inmates said that when you heard them, you would feel an icy chill crawl across your skin. like the presence of something that didn't belong. The whispers were soft at first, just barely audible in the quiet of the cell. But once you heard them, they would keep coming back, growing louder and closer. If you woke up, you wouldn't see anything. Nothing would be there, but you would feel it. Something in the room with you. The worst part of the story? The whispers weren't just for show. If you woke up and didn't acknowledge them, if you tried to ignore them, you would pay. Some inmates said they woke up the next morning with bruises, deep scratches across their skin, and sometimes worse. Other men claimed that they didn't just hear the whispers, they felt them touching them. The whispers would crawl along their backs, their necks, their faces. I didn't believe any of it, of course. I had spent my life in a world where logic reigned, where fear was something to be overcome, not something to believe in. Ghosts, spirits, that stuff was for kids, not grown men. I brushed it off as just another prison tale to scare the new guys, like the one about the Devil's Alley, or the one about the guard who disappeared when he went into the old storage room. But life in Lake Butler has a way of turning your beliefs upside down. It all started when I got into trouble with a couple of gang members who thought it was their right to extort money from me. I wasn't part of their crew, so they came at me. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't afraid of them. The fight was inevitable, and when it happened, it was loud, violent, and filled with rage. But the worst part wasn't the fight itself. It was the consequences. The guards had to break it up, and as soon as they did, they hauled us off to the disciplinary wing. Solitary confinement. Just a couple of weeks alone in a tiny cold cell. At first I didn't mind. In fact, I thought it would be a relief. I didn't have to worry about anyone messing with me, no gang members trying to make their point. Just peace and quiet, and plenty of time to think. But the first few days in solitary weren't as peaceful as I had imagined. The monotony set in quickly. The endless hours of nothing but the sound of my own thoughts. The feeling of being trapped in a steel box with no escape. No phone calls. No visits. Just me and my own mind, and the creeping sense of dread that was starting to settle in. It was on the third night that it all started. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was the sound, or maybe it was just that feeling like I wasn't alone. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but as I lay in my bunk, wide awake and staring at the dark ceiling, I heard it, a whisper. It was so faint at first that I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, but as I strained my ears, I realized it was coming from behind me, not from the door, not from the walls, but from somewhere in the room itself. My breath caught in my throat and I turned, looking into the dark shadows that filled the corners of my tiny cell. Nothing was there, no one, but the whispers didn't stop. It's watching you. The words were muffled, barely more than a breath, but I heard them, and they sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, my knees shaking, and I scanned the room again, trying to find the source of the sound. There was nothing, only the faint light from the moon, casting shadows against the concrete walls. But the whispers, they were real. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I hearing things? Was the isolation getting to me? Or was something else happening here? Something that I couldn't explain? I couldn't stay still. My body was on edge, my heart racing as the whispers continued to swirl around me. I paced back and forth in the tiny space, trying to keep my mind occupied, but it was impossible. The silence that followed the whispers was suffocating, as if the very air was thick with an invisible presence. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that it was just my mind, just the stress of being locked away in that cold, empty cell. But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to grow louder, closer, as if they were moving in on me from all sides. Then suddenly it came again, louder, sharper. "You're not alone." My breath caught in my throat as I whipped around, convinced that someone was standing just behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. The cell was empty, but it didn't feel empty. I rushed to the door, pounding on it with my fists, screaming for the guards to come. But no one came. I screamed again, this time with desperation, my voice cracking under the strain of my fear. It happened because of a fight. The details don't matter much. It was just a stupid altercation with a couple of gang members who were trying to extort me. But in the harsh world of prison, even the smallest act of defiance can lead to serious consequences. After we were separated, I found myself dragged to solitary confinement, thrown into the cold, empty isolation of the box for 2 weeks. At first, I was actually relieved. The thought of being alone, without the constant noise of the other prisoners, seemed like a welcome break. I figured the time would pass quickly. I had a routine ready: wake up, work out, read a book, eat, sleep. I convinced myself that it would be a peaceful few days, a time to clear my head and prepare for whatever came next. But after the third night, things started to unravel. I woke up not from a sound or a voice, but from a feeling. It was like someone was watching me, like there was another presence in the cell, something I couldn't see but knew was there. My heart began to race, and I sat up, looking around the small, dimly lit space. I saw nothing, just the faint moonlight streaming in through the tiny window at the top of the cell. The feeling didn't go away though, it only grew stronger. I lay back down, trying to ignore it, but the whispers started. At first they were faint, like a breeze passing through the cracks in the walls. Then, as if someone had stepped closer, the whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out the words. They were just a jumble of unintelligible sounds, but the tone was unmistakable. It was close. My first thought was that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a byproduct of too many hours alone in that tiny cell. I tried to push the fear out of my head, telling myself that it was nothing more than stress. But then it came again, this time, clearer, right in my ear. "You're not even close." I bolted upright, my pulse hammering in my chest. I scanned the cell, heart racing, but there was nothing. No one was there. Still, I could feel it. Something was in the room with me, something watching. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I slammed my fist against the metal door, shouting for the guards, hoping they would hear me. But there was no response. The whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic, swirling around the room. I felt the temperature drop, and a strange chill washed over me. The fear was unbearable now. I knew I wasn't imagining this. I kept banging on the door, yelling for help, but it wasn't until I heard the heavy, slow footsteps of the guard outside that I thought someone might actually come. A gruff voice called from the other side of the door. "What's your problem now, inmate?" The guard sounded annoyed, his voice sharp. "Please, there's something in here. I'm telling you, you've got to move me out of here," I pleaded, my voice shaky. The guard let out a laugh. "You been listening to those ghost stories again? Ain't nothing in there but you. Go to bed before I come in and make you." His boots echoed down the hallway as he walked away, leaving me alone again with the whispers. But they were gone. As quickly as they had started, they vanished into nothingness. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sounds. It was as if the presence had never been there at all, like I had imagined it. I lay back down, still trembling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew what I had felt, and I wasn't sure I could ever explain it. Do you believe in ghosts, or was I just losing my mind? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Did I experience something supernatural, or was it just the isolation getting to me? I didn't know how much time had passed since I started banging on the door, but it felt like hours. Every minute seemed to stretch into eternity, each second an assault on my sanity. The whispers had stopped, but they lingered in my mind like a dark cloud hovering just out of reach. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, as I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign that someone might be coming to check on me, but nothing. Only silence, and that silence was worse than the whispers. At that moment, it wasn't just the noise that got to me. It was the overwhelming stillness. In that empty, cold cell, I felt as though I was being swallowed whole, consumed by something that I couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't understand. It was as if the prison itself was alive, breathing in sync with me, its walls closing in tighter and tighter, trapping me in its suffocating grip. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, my thoughts swirling in a spiral of panic. What if I never left this place? What if I died in here, forgotten by the world, just another lost soul in the prison's endless maze? Suddenly, I heard a sound, a footstep. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. But then it grew louder, each footfall slow and deliberate. I froze, listening intently. My heart thudded in my chest. The sound of boots hitting the cold concrete floor echoed down the long, narrow hallway outside my cell, but there was no one in sight. It was the kind of sound that could make a man lose his grip on reality, the kind that gnawed at your nerves, making you second-guess everything you thought you knew. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could hear them, perfectly clear. Closer now, right at the threshold of my cell, but I couldn't see anything through the small window. The corridor outside was dark, just a stretch of dimly lit space beyond the heavy steel bars. No guards, no other prisoners, only silence. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it another guard coming to check on me? Had they come to punish me for making a scene? I reached for the small metal slot on the door, the one the guards used to slide meals through. I pressed my face against it, trying to peer through the tiny opening, but the darkness on the other side was impenetrable. The footsteps resumed, slow but steady, moving away from my door. The weight of them pressed against my chest, like the sound itself was a physical thing, a force trying to crush me. I felt an icy chill settle over my skin, creeping up my spine as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And then, just as quickly as they had started, the footsteps stopped again. I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to think straight. The silence was too thick, too suffocating. It was as if the entire world had gone dead, leaving me stranded in this tiny, claustrophobic cell. That's when I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was clearer, more distinct. A voice, a low murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. You're not alone. I froze. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was something darker, something more sinister. The words were clear, heavy with a malevolence that made my stomach churn. I tried to swallow the fear rising in my throat, but it was impossible. The cold sweat on my skin made the chill of the room feel even worse. I could feel the presence in my cell now, just beyond my line of sight, waiting. It wasn't just a voice, it was something that was with me, something that was in the room, close enough that I could almost feel its breath on my neck. My mind screamed at me to move, to get away, to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. The whispers, the footsteps, the darkness, they were all too much. The sound of boots echoed again, but this time they didn't stop. They continued slowly, deliberately, as if something was pacing just outside my cell. I pressed my face to the bars, desperate to see anything, to find some kind of answer to the madness that was slowly taking hold of my mind. But there was nothing. No guard, no prisoner. Only the empty hallway, stretching out before me like an endless void. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was a shadow, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the flickering light from the overhead bulb, casting long twisted shadows across the floor. But then the shadow moved again. It was slow at first, just a slight shift in the darkness, but it grew, expanding across the floor of my cell, crawling toward me like something alive. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the shadow stretch and twist, forming into a shape. Something tall, something hunched, something that didn't belong. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to break down the door and escape whatever nightmare had taken root in that cell. But I couldn't move. The fear had taken hold of me, paralyzing me with a grip so strong it felt like it was choking the life out of me. The shadow loomed larger and the whispers grew louder. "You're not alone." The words were so close now. It was as if the voice was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I could feel the cold air swirling around me, could sense the pressure building in the room. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light anymore. It was a presence, a force. And I knew, deep down, that whatever was in that room with me wasn't something that could be explained by logic. It wasn't a guard or another inmate playing a sick joke. It was something far worse. I spun around, heart racing, and as I did, I saw it. The thing in the corner of the room, the shape that had been creeping closer, growing larger. It was hunched over, its silhouette distorted by the flickering light. But there was something about it that made my stomach turn. It wasn't human. The figure was dark, like a shadow cast from some other world. Its limbs were long and thin, twisting in unnatural ways, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The air around it seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain, and I could feel its gaze, its cold, empty stare, fixated on me. I tried to move, to get away, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, trapped in that moment, unable to break free. The whispers came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You're not alone." The thing in the corner shifted, and in that moment, I realized what I was seeing wasn't just a shadow. It was a presence. It was alive. The air in the cell grew colder, sharper, as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on me, as if the walls of the room were closing in. The whispers continued, growing louder and louder, until it felt like they were screaming in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The shape in the corner of the room was gone. The footsteps outside faded into nothing. The whispers stopped. The coldness lingered for a moment, but even that began to dissipate, leaving only a lingering sense of dread behind. I stood there, shaking, my heart still racing in my chest. My mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened, but I couldn't make sense of it. What had I seen? What had I heard? I didn't know. But what I did know was that whatever had happened to me in that cell, whatever had whispered to me in the dark, was real, and I would never forget it. The guards arrived the next morning to take me for my daily routine. I didn't speak to them. How could I? What could I say? The fear still had a tight grip on me, and the memory of that thing in the corner of the cell was too fresh, too raw to process. I kept my head down, trying to ignore the lingering feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. But the whispers, the footsteps, they were still in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, watched by something that had no business being in this world, something that belonged to the darkness. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to try. All I knew was that I was never the same after that night, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run, I could always feel its presence lurking just out of sight. If you're hooked on this story and want to know what happens next, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. We've got more chilling stories coming your way that you won't want to miss. Stay tuned. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to go through the motions, tried to ignore the lingering presence of whatever had haunted me in that cell, but the feeling didn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow, an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Every creak of the floor, every distant clank of metal on metal made my heart race. Every time I turned a corner or looked down a long hallway, I half expected to see something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The worst part? It wasn't just the physical fear. It was the psychological toll. I couldn't escape the memories of that night, the whispers, the shadow, the way the very air had felt like it was suffocating me. No matter how hard I tried to shake it off, it followed me, and with each passing day, the fear grew, spreading like a cancer. I began having nightmares, horrific, vivid dreams where the shadow returned, chasing me through endless hallways. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Each time I thought I'd escaped, it would find me again. But it wasn't just in my dreams. I could feel it in the waking world too. Every night, when the lights dimmed and the guards did their rounds, I felt its presence, like a cold breath on my neck. It wasn't something I could explain. I knew the prison was old, known for its dark history, its violent past, but this was different. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was something real, something that had slipped into my world and refused to leave. The next night, I couldn't take it anymore. The terror had become unbearable, suffocating me in ways that I couldn't articulate. I had to get out of that cell, out of the prison. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was coming for me. I pulled myself from my bunk, my muscles stiff and aching from the constant tension in my body. I had to do something. I had to take control. I walked over to the door, my mind racing with options, none of them good. The cell was locked. There was no way out, but I had to try. I pounded on the door again, desperate, my fists raw from the repeated blows. The metal felt cold and unyielding under my hands. "Guard! Guard!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. "Please let me out!" I was met with silence. I beat on the door again, louder this time, my entire body shaking with adrenaline. Still nothing. I could hear footsteps approaching in the distance, distant at first, but growing louder, closer. My heart leapt into my throat. Was it the guard finally coming to check on me? I looked down the hall. The shadows seemed to stretch out before me like dark tendrils, crawling toward me, reaching for me. The hall was empty, but the footsteps, they were getting closer. A moment of hope surged through me. Finally, someone was coming. Maybe the guard would hear my cries. Maybe he'd take me out of this nightmare of a cell. But the closer the footsteps got, the more wrong they sounded. They were too slow, too deliberate, and they didn't echo like they should on the hard concrete floor. I stepped back from the door, a cold dread creeping up my spine. There was something off about this, something deeply unsettling. I heard the steps stop outside my cell. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my ear against the cold steel of the door. My skin prickled. The footsteps, they were too close, too real. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, in the stillness of that moment, I heard it again. A whisper. "You're not alone." I froze. The words sent a chill straight down my spine. I slowly backed away from the door, my pulse racing in my ears. My head spun with confusion, fear, and disbelief. Was I losing my mind? Had the stress of everything finally broken me? I turned in a panic, looking around the empty cell. But the shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, more alive. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My senses screamed at me that something was in the room, something just out of sight. I was alone, but I wasn't. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My vision blurred and I felt my knees go weak. I sank to the cold floor, my back against the wall, trying to make sense of the madness that had consumed me. And then, out of nowhere, the shadow appeared again. It wasn't like before. It didn't creep in from the corners. This time, it materialized. At first it was just a blur in the corner of my eye, but then in a sickening shift it solidified. The air grew colder, the walls seemed to close in tighter, and the shadows seemed to swell, twisting, forming into something more tangible. I couldn't look away. The shape was like a man, but not quite. It had the figure of a human, but its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin, stretching impossibly far. The shadow seemed to shimmer and warp, bending at strange angles. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me. I could feel them boring into my soul. It moved closer, each step slow and deliberate, and with every footfall, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "You're not alone." I tried to scream, but my throat was tight. My voice stuck somewhere deep inside. The fear had turned to pure, unrelenting terror, a terror that had taken control of my body and mind. I was trapped, unable to move, unable to escape. The thing, whatever it was, stopped right in front of me. Its presence was suffocating, the air thick with dread. I could feel it watching me, studying me, as if it were deciding something. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The shadow vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the oppressive silence in its wake. I was left sitting on the cold floor, my body trembling, my mind reeling. What had just happened? What was that? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going crazy. Whatever I had seen, whatever I had felt, it was real, and it wasn't done with me. If you think you've felt terror like this before or have experienced something similar, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Don't miss the next part of this chilling story and the next horrifying tale we have in store. Keep watching, keep reading, and stay safe, because you never know what could be lurking in the shadows.